In this video, we'll explore bodies and components. After completing this step, you'll be able to identify bodies and components in Fusion 360, explain the benefits of using components in a design, and explain what functionality requires the use of components. In Fusion 360, we're going to get started with three separate designs: Utility Knife-Bodies, Utility Knife-Upload, and Create Components. We want to make sure that all three of these are uploaded to the data panel and open so we can explore them. Utility Knife-Bodies and Utility Knife-Upload are the same designs, with the exception of one is using components and one is using bodies. As we look at this, we want to make sure that we identify the differences in the workflow and what changes might be required to convert bodies to components. First, as we look at Utility Knife-Upload, we'll notice that each of these icons has an eye next to it, and these are components inside of a design. If we expand them, you'll notice that they have their own origin, their own bodies folder, and in this case, a decals. What I want to do here is I'm going to hide the origin, and I want to show the origin for the blade cradle. The blade cradle origin is based at the center of the design, and as I move the blade cradle in and out, notice that the origin moves with it. The default origin for the design is stationary in the design, and notice that it stays fixed in this one position. Fusion 360 maintains a record of where the coordinate systems for each of the components go. It maintains the distance between as well as the rotation in relation to the default origin. And anytime we move a component, Fusion 360 wants to either capture its position or revert back to its original position. The use of components in a design is required whenever we want to add that mechanical motion. If we go back to the utility knife bodies, note that I'm not able to move any of these around unless I use the modify tool Move Copy. In order to make these bodies components, we need to expand the bodies folder. I can select all of the bodies that I want, excluding form body. I'm going to right click and create components from body. Now each of these is free to move about inside of my coordinate system because Fusion 360 doesn't know how they're supposed to move in relation to each other. I can revert their position and put them back, but notice that the blade cradle and the blade are free to move about without interacting with each other. If I want to make them interact with each other, I can create what's called a joint. In this case, I'll make a quick as-built joint, creating a rigid joint type between the blade cradle and the blade itself. I'll say OK, and now when I move one, they both move together as if they're fixed. So this is one way in which we can tell Fusion 360 how these components are going to interact with each other. There are other benefits to components in a design. When we're creating an animation or an exploded view, you'll need these components to be able to move these parts around. When we're making detailed drawings, it simplifies the use of parts tables, and it also gives us a good way to build out our assemblies in a meaningful manner. Let's take a look at the design Create Components. This design doesn't have any additional components in it, and it has a single sketch. I want to look at the different ways in which we can create components in a design, and I want to focus our attention on what happens with those components and what happens in our timeline. First, I'm going to use Create Extrude. I'm going to select one of these rectangles and simply pull it up a distance of 35 millimeters. I'm going to use the default New Body operation and say OK. I want to show Sketch 1 again because we're going to continue to use this. We've now created a body inside of this design. Notice that we have a Bodies folder and Body 1. I'm going to repeat the process using Extrude, pulling it up 35 millimeters, but this time the operation I'm going to change to New Component. This time, notice in the timeline that we have a Create Component as well as an Extrude. When we look at the browser, we now have Component 1, and inside of Component 1 we have a Bodies folder and we have its own origin. So the one that we created as a body is fixed in space. However, the one we created as a component is free to move about. The sketch still stays in place where we designed it. However, the body itself inside of this component and the component itself can move around. We can revert back to that position, or we can capture its new position. One benefit to using the component method is that we can activate a component, it'll change the opacity of all other bodies or components, and it'll simplify the timeline showing only the sketches and features that were used to create that component. Let's go back to the top level and let's use the Assemble New Component option. We're going to create a new standard component internal to this design. We're going to use the parent as the top level, which is Create Components, and we're going to activate it. We'll say OK, and now we want to create a new sketch. I'm going to select the XZ plane, and I'm going to use a 2-point rectangle to simply create another rectangle off and to the right and finish my sketch. Now, once again, we'll use Extrude. We'll pull this up a distance of 35 millimeters. This time we're creating a new body. We're creating a new body because we're already inside of a component, so we're going to say OK. If we expand this, you'll note that we have Component 2, the body, but we also have a Sketches folder. We have a Sketches folder because the sketch was created inside of the active component rather than at the top level. When we go back and we activate the top level, notice that we have all the sketches, the features, the create components, anything that was used in this entire design. But if we go back to individual components, we'll only see the features or the different operations that were used for that specific instance. So with component 2, we have a new sketch that was created as well as an extrude. With component 1, we created the component during the extrude operation. At the very top level, we'll see all the sketches, components, and the different features. Understanding the bodies and components workflow is going to take a little bit of time and practice. But in general, the best way to go about modeling in Fusion 360 is to start with an empty component and then begin creating your sketches and bodies inside of each component. This has downstream benefits, again, for organizing the timeline, but also creating that mechanical motion. There's nothing wrong with creating additional bodies and converting them to components, but again, we will simplify the timeline, making it easier for us to take a look at the sketches and features that were used in specific components. From here, let's go ahead and activate the top level and make sure that we save before moving on.